Okay, so today's subject matter is the robin, another common all garden bird that we have visiting us, and it's a delightful little character with his red breast. Um, and that's the thing that you first notice. It's not quite as red as we might have thought. It's more of an orange red tone. So that's the first observation. And very much like the sparrow last week, he does have a pattern and a multicolored note to him. So if we really observe the bird carefully, we will see that not only does he have this orangey red breast, he's also got a sort of a raw umber grey tone wing, which is fascinating. The underside of his tail appears to have that similar color, although there is a highlight on the rim of it. And then we have his chest here, down to his feet. So the lower sort of body, it's a creamy color, but with little speckles. Not really sure how to describe it other than speckles. And I'm not sure if that changes as the bird matures. This one appears to me to be a young robin, but I could be wrong. But he does have a little dappled patination, which is rather nice. And then as the color goes upwards towards his sort of shoulder there, you see that it becomes a lighter umber gray. So we have a sort of raw sienna and a white tone meets a raw umber gray. That's interesting. The other thing that just kind of comes to mind is his beak. So, excuse me, but his beak has a wonderful shape to it. It is open and there's a symmetry involved. So we kind of try to capture that, but not only that, there's a parallel aspect as well. So here on the sort of gape of his mouth there, this side and that side are very similar. And then we have a beak that stretches upwards. There is a little bit of rim lighting, a small slither of light at the top beak there. You can kind of see it. And then the bottom beak, because it's extending, I'm thinking he's probably waiting for his mother to come with some food. I could be wrong, but that's what I'm kind of guessing, because his mouth seems quite wide. So that reminds me of a fledgling. But I didn't realize they get this color when they're young, so I could be wrong. But we can see the width of his mouth, and there is a perspective issue that we need to consider. So we'll have to line a tilt up through the mouth as it opens there. But we can do that as we're drawing. And his eye, a little bit like the sparrow last week, the eye is like a single grape from a blackberry, if you see what I mean. It's round, it's completely black, except for a little bright highlight. So we need to remember to reserve that. Otherwise, we'll have to paint it on later with gouache. And then I'm coming towards his feet. And if we look at the feet, I'll just zoom in because it's quite tricky to see his feet like it was last week with the sparrow. But if I zoom in, maybe this will give us a better idea. Okay. Now he's holding on to the branch. It's got some lichen on it. I kind of like that, no pun intended, with that yellow-green tone. Kind of scaly plant, isn't it? Very scaly. And then his feet are a pinkish gray with these little talons, his little toenails hanging on. Quite interesting. Not so much detail there because it's quite tricky to see. So we'll have fun trying to explain the feet, but we better try, as we saw before. And then one last thing before we begin, look at his fluff on his wing here by his kind of armpit. You know, this area here has a slight movement as if the wind has caught it or he's ruffled his feathers as he's flown. But anyway, whatever that is, we've got to reserve the light there, and that tells us where the light source is directed from. So let's look at the light. One last thing before we begin. So when we look at the light on the bird, it's coming from probably above left. And that's why we have a terminator here that kind of follows around. Notice there's a separation here on his throat where there is a little bit of light, but it sort of steps out from the shadow because he's chirping away. He's calling out, I guess, to his mum, doing things that baby birds do. But this is all shadow, so it turns away from the light on his belly. And we have a shadow underneath his wing here, which we'd better include as well as the shadow on his tail, which is totally away from the light. Other than that, the last shadow that I shall mention is in his mouth, because his mouth is open. And although the inside of his mouth is a sort of whitish pink, it's a gray because of the shadow that's happening, because his mouth is turning away from the light. And there's a rim light on the edge of his beak because the light is hitting that. Okay, I hope that makes sense for everybody. I'm going to just check the chat, everyone's okay. Just check that Wendy's not trying to get in. No sign of Wendy just yet, but she may appear. So with that in mind, we're going to begin drawing. So how do we begin drawing? Well, I'm going to share another screen now, so hopefully I can get these two in sync. I do have the value map, as you'd expect. That will be later when we finish the drawing. But for now, hopefully you're going to see the second screen, which is my pad. Now, I have had a go at this one before, and you can take this portrait, or if you wish to be true to the photograph, which is entirely up to you, you could turn your page this away. So landscape, when I tried it, landscape, I found, yes, it does work, landscape, but you have a lot of space on the right, which may be a little bit, I don't know, boring. But if you wanted to use this as perhaps the theme for a Christmas card next year, or some Christmas style greeting note, you could use that for a rhyme or some kind of you know, Christmassy inclusion. Could be a poem or something, or a hymn. That's all I'm thinking. But for me this time, I'm going to try portrait. I'm going to see how that works. And I'm going to begin by looking at the basic shape. So when we look at birds, it is a good idea to think about the, oh, Bill says Wendy said she would be skiing today. So thanks, Bill. Yeah, she didn't, she? I've got a terrible memory, by the way. So yeah, I do remember now. So when I look at any animal, I'm starting to look for the basic shape. Now, last week we noticed the sparrow had an egg shape, and guess what? It's a very good way to start with the robin. So there's an egg shape. You can just about see it. And if you can see the egg shape, you can also see that there is a line of symmetry, therefore, through the egg shape. Might help you that way. when you're starting out your drawing. Now, where would you place it on your pad? Well, or your page? That's going to be up to you. But if I think about the branch as part of the overall composition, I think that's a good idea, because you want your bird to have some kind of context, because the background is perfect for us today, because there's very little there. It's just a couple of tones. So that's a very watercolorist friendly background. But we'll need to think about the perch. So I'm just going to put a tilt kind of like so. And I'm going to put that down in the bottom quarter. The reason I need a quarter, or you can bring it up to a third if you wish. It's entirely up to you where you place it, as long as there's enough room to fit the bird. But I'm thinking I need a little bit of space for the tail to overhang. Yeah. So I think that tilt there is 16 minutes past the hour, as the simplest shape I can summons to begin with. So there's my line. Give you some time to get there. No rush with this one. As we found with the sparrow, there's just enough detail for our time, and better to get the details how we want it rather than rush. So once you've got your branch, remember you have the option of portrait or landscape. This one will work either way. Then the next job is to think about putting the egg shape on. So you can see that there's a tilt here. This is not including the tail. So the tail is a separate aspect, because they kind of balance themselves a little bit with their tail. So the tail can sort of tilt sort of independently of the body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take the tilt for the body, and I think it's about 10 past the hour or 11 minutes past, something like that. There we are. Going to make it big enough for the pad so that the head sits on the top. And then once you've got your tilt, it's about 11 minutes past the hour. Then you can start to draw an egg shape. Now, you'll need an idea of the width ratio. So if I put a sort of a cross through there, I would estimate that the width ratio is about 2/3 of the entire length, there and thereabouts. So what would that mean? Well, if that's the limits of my length for the body, I could take 2/3 of that. So I'm measuring 2/3, turn it on its side. And now if I can balance that, which is not so easy, but can just about do it, so that I've got 1/3 of the length on the bottom and 1/3 of the length on the top side. So another way of seeing that, if you're really struggling with fractions on these sort of shapes, you could find 1/3 along the length, something that you fit 1/3, and then draw your cross like so. And it's going to be adjacent to that line. So at 90 degrees. Once you've got that, then it's a case of drawing the egg shape. And the easiest way I find is arcing from from bottom to top, like so. If you're left-handed, you might prefer to start from the bottom and go outwards to that point and then upwards. But really and truthfully, it doesn't really matter, because you'll get practice on both curves. And there he is. Now, all of this is sort of rule of thumb. And at any point during the first stage of the blocking in process, whilst we're making the envelope for the robin, you can pull and push, squeeze, stretch, whatever you need to do to get it to feel like the robin that you're seeing. That's very important to know, that you're not 100% tied to this shape, but it does help us as a starting point. Hope that gives you an understanding of that this is important, but it's not the rule. Your eye must be your priority, and you must feel confident to trust it. Okay, so far we're doing quite well because we're managing that shape. Now I'm going to look for another tilt. This time I'm going to mark it in blue. I'm going to put it on the outside edge of the wing here, because I see that it kind of links with the body there. Do you see? It has a link there. So if you've managed to create your egg shape, you can join your tilt to the egg somewhere higher up, about there, or maybe there. And then the tilt that's going to be at the correct angle for the tail is about 6 minutes past the hour. I'm going to say 6 minutes, because sometimes it's quite tricky to know for sure. Now, I'm not quite sure the fraction involved just yet of how much that tail overhangs. Excuse me. But we can work that out in a moment. It's more important to get the angle of that sort of 6 minutes. Is it 7 minutes? I'll let you decide. But if you're using a knitting needle, try to match the angle on your page with the resource, give or take. And I think, again, if you're out 1 minute, it shouldn't matter too much, because the tail moves. The tail is not fixed. It's independent. It can move up and down. So as long as it's believable, that's a good thing. Right, so we have the envelope for the belly, an egg. We have a line for the tail. And now we need to think about how to move forward. So I'm going to take another tilt now. Notice I'm going to ignore the beak. I'm just going to draw the side. I'm going to attempt to draw from the side of the egg shape, that's his chest, along his throat, all the way through the beak line, where it's the side of his mouth is, to the top of his head. And there's a tilt there, do you see it? And this time, I'm going to join that at his chest here. And I think that this tilt is about 3 or 4 minutes to the hour this time. And again, you do have a little bit of flexibility, you know, because the bird's head is independent of the body as well. So it can move a little bit up and down, and it will still be believable. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time on that. When we come to the top of the head, we'll need to know how to limit the height of his head. And I would suggest, if we just look at the point of the head there to the curve of the egg there, and then the oh, didn't mean to do that, sorry about that. And then the line of his center of the egg there, the crossing point, it's almost similar, isn't it, as a step, that height. Perhaps from the neck to the top of the head is just a tiny bit smaller in length, or height, sorry, from the middle of the egg to the top of the egg, if you see what I mean. So if you have that position from the top of the egg to the center, and then you take that to the top of the bird's neck. So we know that that's close, but it doesn't need to be quite so high, just a little bit less. And I think that will put us in good stead. Now, of course, when you sort of guesstimate a fraction like that, because we didn't want to get our rulers out and start measuring, that takes the joy out of it. We do have something that's quite close, and we know it's not 100% yet. So again, that's not totally fixed. It's just to help us. And as I always say, as a drawing progresses, the more information we've got, the more we have to contrast with. So each line we put down is something to help us work out if that line's correct. And when we have enough contexts of different lines, we can then start to pull and stretch, or push and pull, shrink any lines, any shapes that we need to wherever, because until we have more information, there's no point really in editing too much. Right, so I'm just drawing that line on the outside of his neck on the left. And I don't know if you noticed, but I noticed it's very similar to the line of his tail, that tilt. So if I take that tilt, that exact angle there, and then I push it up to the crossing point there of the egg, this width, just to there, and I take that tilt and I transplant it up there, it's almost as if this line continues at that angle, but steps it in a little bit at his shoulder. And that will really help to get an idea of the width of his head. We've got an idea of the height of his head. And then the last line that I put on is this little chiseled line here at the top of the back of his head, if that makes sense. Just here, there's a slight slope. Do you see it? So I put that angle in, and I'm estimating that that's about 12 minutes, 10, 11, 12 minutes, maybe somewhere there. And that's putting me in good stead now. I can really see that my envelope with an egg and a slightly bucket shaped top of the head and a line is now giving me something really good to work from. So I'm going to pause for a minute there to allow you to catch up if you need it, before I move on, because there's no rush, as I mentioned, but it's better to take a little bit more time to see if you can gauge things more accurately. So as I say, I'm going to be quiet now and let you catch up. If you've already done that and you wanted to move on, of course, please do. And maybe your next position to look at is the branch, getting the width of the branch correct. Okay, I hope that's given you sufficient time. I'm going to move on now to the branch, because the branch, although seemingly not so important as the bird is our subject, the branch is an interesting contextual element. So what I've noticed, just by putting these little measurements from the top of his head to his neck to the center of the body there, and then where the egg touches the branch, there's kind of 3 steps, like on a ladder, very similar proportions and lengths. And it just so happens that the branch is not too far from that kind of thickness as well. But you can see it's a little bit thinner than the 3/3 in the height of the body to the head of the bird. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little line here, literally where the egg shape touches down horizontally. That's the outermost edge of the branch. So if I wanted to draw the branch, which is my next task, I'm just going to now start to look for the curvature and see how it sweeps from above left down to the lower right. So it doesn't really matter, as I mentioned before, with certain things that can be like a branch in nature, that there may be different thicknesses of branch on the tree. And the fact that the bird sat on this particular branch is quite random, I guess, or could be. And therefore, you do have some flexibility. There is leeway. You don't have to get it exactly right. So, as I mentioned, I think it's smaller than 1/3. So if I take a measurement like the shape of the head there, the height from the neck to the top of the head, and then I take that to the top of the branch, I know it's going to be smaller because I've already worked out. I'm not sure exactly how much smaller, but it's not so important really. But I did notice something else. I don't know if you saw this as well, but the tail seems to be to there. And if I take a line across on the horizontal, the lowest point of the tail is about halfway to the bottom of the branch from his feet. Do you see that? So in other words, that step on the ladder from his feet to the branch is the same distance as the step from the bottom of the branch to the level of his tail. It's just random, as I say. It never always be like that again, perhaps. But if you spot things like that, it can help, because now I know how far to bring the tail in context to the branch. And I can also start to create a parallel curve. Of course, it's not entirely or exactly the same, but it's similar to a parallel curve. So now, with that parallel curve, I'm happy that my bird could be believed to be sitting on that as a branch, and that is the critical factor. As with any painting and drawing, it's not necessary to get an absolute photographic likeness unless that's your particular interest. But what is necessary, even if photographic realism is your interest, it is important that it's believable. And if we can believe it, it's usually down to common sense things. You know, if it makes sense, we believe it. It's a psychological aspect to painting and drawing that is often overlooked. Okay, so I have a branch. I have my envelope for my bird. I'm really happy now to begin going into detail. This is when you can start to go into detail. So how do we begin that? And is there anything that can help us? Well, it just so happens there are some things that can help us, because we're going to have quite a tricky time to get the eye of the bird in the correct position if we don't think about it. So that would be something that I would begin to look for rhythmic indicators. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is quite advanced stuff because it sometimes takes years to develop an eye to see this, but I want to show you it because it is there if you look for it. Do you see it as I draw this line from his shoulder there, or his top of his chest, or the bottom of his neck, through to that angle on his skull? And then if I take another line from his beak and draw that through to his other side, to there. Didn't do a very good job of that one, but you can see what I mean. Do you see what I'm getting at there? Using this knitting needle from there to the point on his head there, assuming that we got our original positions correct, if I put another line there now, and then I do the same from that shoulder to where I'm going to assume the beak is, which is there, it's a tilt. And the angle for this tilt is adjacent to the angle of that tilt. It's at 90 degrees, so that really helps, pretty much. Or something very close. And that tells me where his eye is, because his eye is cradled pretty much in the top position above the cross. So I look for these things because otherwise I would be kind of guessing where that eye is going to sit. Now, just because I have drawn that doesn't mean, with a knitting needle, doesn't mean it's 100% accurate, but it's close. Why is it not 100% accurate? Well, my knitting needle is a number 3.5 millimeters, which means the thickness is 3.5 mil. It means the line can be out by 3.5 mil. So once you've done what I've just showed you how to do with this sort of cross, then you must compare the original with your drawing, because it will be out. It's definitely going to be out. But by how much, I'm not sure. So here's another way to help to see if there's a closer definition you can find. If you now put a line through the belly, the cross point of the belly, and then through, you know, like a kite shape through that line, you should find that this tilt links to, you see that funny shape on the top of his head there, the other angle should cross through his eye, through all the crossing points, down to his feet. And now I know exactly how to find that point for his eye. Now, of course, there is a possibility that you have like I probably have got a misalignment here and there because of the thickness of my knitting needle. And you're going to find out now if you do. And I found out I do a little bit. So what am I going to do about it? Well, I'm just going to stretch that across there. I'm going to push the eye back a little bit, and I'm going to make it work, because you can make it work. And what I've just showed you, all of that, those guides, we can see it. It's on the photograph. There's clearly some rhythmic quality there, but if we can't get it exact on our drawing, it's probably because our knitting needle was a little bit out. So we make it happen. Now, if you were with me with the Charles Barg drawing classes, I know some of you were, not all of you, but some of you, you'll notice that we saw this again and again when we were looking at Charles Barg's figures, these rhythmic lines which have a synchronicity throughout the body. So it's not just in birds, it's in people too. It's in all, probably pretty much all animals. You'll find these synchronistic rhythms. So we make use of it. So I feel really happy now that the eye, at least, is in a better position. And it also helps me a little bit to get the scale of that eye, because it can't be too big. I've got to fit it within that little triangle there. So if I make it too big, it will look out of scale. So hope that's helped you. I know it was a long route to get where we were going, but it's also giving us two other pieces of very useful information. Number one, we now know that this till links through to the top beak. So we've got the top beak. Number two, if you manage to synchronize your knitting needle through the two sort of checkerboard crosses there and there, you'll also find where the feet sit on the branch. The feet are going to be down here. So that's another valuable happening through the drawing process. So now I've got the eye position, believe it or not, I'm just going to erase all of those guide marks. So I hope you didn't do them too dark, because now we're going to go into detail. So there it is. Funny shape it is now. I'm going to erase all of this so that we can begin. But before I do, just remember that the outside edge of the tail just there is what we have drawn down here. So this is the outside edge. And I'm going to begin with the tail just so that that's fresh in our memories. Okay, so I'm going to clear off all of the drawings now. There they go. Right, so I've got my bird's body and I've got the branch. Now I would like to draw the tail. I've got this line, as I say, so there's the starting point. And then on the other side of the tail, there's an outer edge as well, which if I use my knitting needle, it kind of it diverges here, so it's a bit wider down here, and then it converges as it goes upwards. So it's a slightly triangular shape I'm seeing. And then we've got almost like a fish tail. Notice that the left-hand side cleaved shape for the fishtail is slightly bigger than the right-hand side. So that should work, something like that. And so that's really helped. And now I can erase the guideline through the branch. So that's no longer necessary. So where to next? Well, we've got options. I'm going to go, funnily enough, to the beak, because we have part of the beak, we've got this aspect here. So that's good. Notice how close it comes towards the eye. And then we're going to need to find the next tilt. Now, if we follow the line of the bottom beak, it also is very close to the eye, you see? So that could help us, because I know we've got this line, we've worked that one out, but now we've got the eye and we know where the eye is, we can put our knitting needle to the other side. So I'll just reinstate this line so you can see what I mean. And I'm going to turn this knitting needle till I find the angle, which I think it's about 16, maybe 17 minutes past the hour. And then as I bring this out, you'll see that small triangle peeping out to the hinge of the mouth, goes upwards, and then like so. So you end up with those two little sharp protrusions, which they're like little triangles, little thorns. Now, if you've managed that, whatever you've drawn here on the outside edge of the mouth, so there's the hinge. I'm trying to find sort of, it's not quite center. And you know, you've got to allow for the fact that, yes, maybe the beak would be, the hinge would be the center, but we are slightly lower than the bird, I believe, just a little bit. His eye level is a little bit higher than ours, perhaps. Or it's very close. The reason I think that is because we're seeing more of the inside of the upper beak than we do the lower beak. So I think we're just ever so slightly lower, looking upwards to the bird's eye. So with that in mind, the hinge of the mouth is slightly lower than halfway. And so whatever I've done here, I'm going to now repeat a similar asymmetry for the other side of the mouth. But there is another factor I would like you to consider, which is the perspective of the hinge of the mouth, i.e. the little bit that's here and here, where the two halves of the beak will meet in a pursing of the beak, like so. And I think that that angle is 14 minutes past the hour. So that gives me a very good indication then where the crease of the hinge of the mouth will be, somewhere there. So I hope that helps, because that's not an easy area to tackle. And do you see what I did? I made all of these lines of the lower beak meet that line of the perspective, and I did the same with the upper part of the beak coming down. And in that way, I think you're going to manage something that's very believable, and that's the important thing about drawing. It must be believable. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to get there, and then we'll move onwards. And if you do manage to get that drawn out, you can then erase any guidelines that you've accrued in the sketching. So he's gradually coming to life, which is, it's nice to see. Right, so where do we go next? Well, remember, everything is a consideration based upon the sum of all of the parts. So at any point where you start to think, oh, it's not actually an egg shape, there's a bit more to it, try to imitate in your mind's eye what you're seeing. So I'm going to now move on to the wing. So originally I had this egg shape, which doesn't contain all of the wing. You'll see as I put the egg shape, reinstate the egg shape, you'll see that I clip off a little bit of the wing because I'm looking for the general overall shape. That's always my consideration. So if we see that, therefore, in the context of the egg, the wing overhangs here, and it also has its own little tilt to consider, but it is more of a curve. Do you see? It sort of curves on the inside, and it also curves on the outside. And it does indeed curve back into the egg shape. So with that in mind, we now start to sketch into our drawing and we add the wing upon what we have. So I sketch the outside of the wing, going to leave a little bit of room between the inside of the wing here and the egg shape of his body. Do you see there's a little negative shape triangle just there? So I need to make that happen in the drawing as best as I can. And this is where you will have fun stretching and perhaps pushing the lines out to make it fit. And that's a natural aspect of drawing. And it doesn't mean that what you did before was wrong. It just means that what you're doing now is more correct, hopefully, because a drawing is like an agreement, you know, we just kind of find parts of it work for so long and then we have to renegotiate it, and then when we're happier that it's working, we can move on again. It doesn't mean to say it's fixed in that position. We might change it again, but until we have more information, we can't really say. Okay, so how do we know where the bottom of the wing is? Well, it is tricky actually. There's this bit here that seems to join, but it doesn't really. There's actually some fluff here. He's got some little fluffy feathers. So I've got a feeling it might join about there. It's a little depression there, a little shadow. But that's more of a detail. So I'll come back to that. So I need to find that point there. And I believe that if I was to draw a line horizontally through the crease of his jacket there, it's about there. That should give us something to gauge from. It's quite tricky to draw that line, but there it is. So I think there, it's about 2/3 of the way up from the bottom of the egg to the top of the egg, somewhere there. There's the top of the egg. And as long as you're happy that it looks like that's where the wing could be, that's fine. And then I'm going to try my best to negotiate a little space for where the wing tucks under here. Now I kind of saw another line there. It's might just be imagined again, but I just see if I follow a line upwards from here through to the arm, to the wing where it creases in, and down to his feet there. Sort of a line there. And that helps me a little bit. Nothing too concrete, but it's a good a friendly point. Right, so we're doing pretty well now. We've got a wing, we've got the tail, we've got the beak. We now know what, oh, we've got his eye or something close. So where next? Well, of course, the feet, those feet. Now, they are probably the trickiest aspect, but we're very lucky because with this bird, it's kind of hidden a little bit on the lichen. So that's useful. So I'll clear off all of those guidelines. I'm going to focus on the feet. I'll just draw a very loose gesture line for the first foot. There we go. So I make it as simple as I can. It's two little tilts. So one little tilt coming out from below. Tilts down slightly, doesn't it, towards the branch. Luckily for me, I already know where that bend of the upper leg and the foot, because that was the line, if you remember, that we found going through all of the cross points and the eye. And that leads you there to that little bend somewhere there. Again, you're going to decide. But those two tilts, they're kind of the same length as well. That's useful. One is 14 minutes past the hour. The other is 20 minutes or so, 22 minutes past the hour, something like that. Which is good. And then the other foot, we don't really see all of the other foot. We only see the bottom part of the foot. And I'm just going to put a little curve there. Just for now, a very simple little curve. Like so. So there's one leg, one of the feet, and then there's where I'm going to put the other foot. Good. Now, what does that give us? Well, that gives us something to work on too. So once you've got those guidelines, then I'm going to zoom in for detail because I'm going to sketch those two legs now. Right, here goes. So zooming in time. Now, as I mentioned before, feet on birds, pretty tricky things. And again, they're not, because they move, they kind of flex and they twist and they sort of gnarl around each other a bit. You see that? Quite a bit of information. But one thing I have noticed about birds' feet and legs in general is they kind of look like bones. So if you see here, this part of the foot is joined to this leg bone, which really looks like a bone when you study it. I know it's hidden, the elbow's sort of hidden in there, but it's like a little bone. Not very much meat on it. So I'm going to just make a sort of gnarly looking little bone. Keep it thin and notice that it gets thinner in the middle of the bone and then more sort of more it diverges a little bit towards the knuckle of, you know, this part of the joint. Gets a little bit bigger. These are the sort of bony condyles that it links to the next part of the foot, something like that. And then we have a toe. The main toe actually goes all the way, it's like the middle toe. And it too is gnarly and thin and then gets wider like that. And it kind of reminds me of E.T. E.T.'s finger. It's long and pointy. It's a bit bubbly at the end. It's thin. And then you've got a little hook. That little talon comes out. So that's... And that really starts to then look like a bird's foot. And it's not really that tricky, as long as you can get the sort of proportions, which I'm sure we can. Right, so there's one of the toes. There is another toe, of course. If I change the color of the pencil, the toe that's nearest to us, pardon me, is also sort of slightly foreshortened. So it's turning towards us a little bit. So we don't see a lot of it. And it's like a little hook with a little barbed, and then the little bulbous toe again. And then that leads back to the wrist joint, or whatever that's called, little phalange. And there it is. It starts to look like a bird's foot. We've got two toes, and we need the third one, which is slightly hidden from us, so we don't have to draw a lot, and that's a blessing. We see another little claw a little bit lower down, stepping out just a little bit. And if you can get the sort of profile silhouette of those toes, you know, that's enough, because those silhouettes are very powerful information sharers. I've mentioned this before, you know, the shape of the bear at the cave entrance at night, the silhouette is enough to tell us what it is immediately. It's the same with these little feet. You know, it's interesting, we recognize that these shapes are birds' feet. Simple as that. As long as we can get the proportions and those little hooks, and suddenly we go, oh yeah, that's it's rather contorted, but it's a believable foot. So I hope that's helped you. And then we move on to a similar kind of episode with the other claw. So I just draw the outside silhouette shape. It's, again, very similar to Steven Spielberg's E.T. with those long fingers, hinging with slightly bulbous knuckles. And then finally, the barb of that hook linking into the branch. So if we can get those factors, it's going to be believable. And then we just repeat with the furthest claw. And if you have to edit your branch to make it work better, then please do so. It's your drawing and you make it work. And lastly, it's quite tricky to see this one. I have to say, I may even not be seeing it correctly, but if I zoom in again, you'll see that there is a third claw, and it's so foreshortened, it makes it very difficult to see, but you can see it. It's facing us, and it's this little third toe, slightly further back. And I think if you were to leave it out, I don't think it would be a major issue, but it is there. So I'm going to try my best to include it. There it is. So I'm now much happier with that. And that zoom there gives us a very interesting view of the lichen. It's like, looks like a lettuce or a cabbage leaf. So yeah, if you want to draw the lichen, that wouldn't be a bad idea. But I will come back to the lichen perhaps. So there it is. That starts to look like my bird, and already, just from moving from what the view of the feet to the wider view, I'm starting to see things which I'd like to change, like the wing shape. So sometimes just changing your view or even having a little break, you'll see all of these errors or areas that need changing. So I'm making the wing a little bit wider there. That's good. But if you're at that stage, you're ready then to go into the patterned details. And when I talk about the pattern details, I'm looking for things again which are characteristic of this bird species. So I'm looking for the red breast. That's the first thing I will look for. Then I'm looking at the wing feathers. They're interesting. Need to include those. The mottled feathers as well, perhaps. And finally, the shadows, the shadow map. So hope that is helping you so far with your journey with your robin study. I'm going to now start to look at the pattern on the red breast. So here goes. Of course, I'm going to simplify it, but if we look, the pattern actually starts on his forehead there, and it weaves itself around his eye like a little mask, and then around his shoulder, and then it navigates down. It's a bit fluffy, but it navigates itself around his chest to his breast, and there it is. That's the shape we're looking at. Interestingly, there are some fluffy bits on the outside edge here and here, where we have the articulation, the movement of the neck. So that's something I will include. So that's my next job. And I would recommend you draw this, sketch this in lightly, because the red orange tone is not a very dark tone. So you don't want to give yourself a problem where the paint doesn't cover your lines. So go easy. But one important aspect to remember is that the pattern, being organic, can be a little bit flexible. You know, I guess if you were to see a robin next to another robin next to it, it's not going to be identical. So you have a little bit of leeway. Probably quite a bit of leeway, to be fair. So there's my shape for the red breast. I'm going to put the little fluffy bits on his neck. Kind of like that. That will work very well in watercolor. Those sort of aspects always do. They add the movement as well, because that fluff indicates he's a little bit ruffled. Maybe the wind, or maybe he's just landed. So that's good. I'm also going to look at this aspect of his throat there, where the red area is in shadow, but also there's an area like a little island that's in light. So there is that area there, and I'm going to make a note of that. Because I'd like to reserve that as a light. And then I move on to the wing, because I've got enough information to help me paint his red breast. Now, for the wing, you'll notice that just as with the sparrow, there's different feathers on the wing. So we have these longer feathers at the top, these medium-sized feathers at the top. And I see like a group of 3, and it's about the top third of the wing. Something like that. And it's got a very rounded feel to the top. I can also see the fluffiness as well, and that is very close. So I'm going to sketch the fluffiness in. Because I'd like to reserve that as a light. It's not essential, but it's just something in the photograph that might be of interest. And again, fluffiness means it suggests movement of the wind, or he's just moved. It might just animate the watercolor a little bit. So I'll put that in. So that's good. A little bit of fluffiness there. Got his top feathers, and now I'm looking at these concertinaed feathers. Now, you could take your time and count them all to a feather, but that's not necessary really if you want an impression of the bird. Even a botanical style detailed impression, you don't need to have every single feather, but you probably noticed there, we all in our minds can imagine 6 feathers. There's more than 6. So as long as I can put more than 6, like so, that's good. I noticed that there are a couple of little feathers here that sort of, they fan into each other and they're a bit shorter. So I made a note of that one. It's a bit shorter, but it fans into the curve. That would be interesting. And then lower down here, there's a lighter one that catches a little bit of light. So that might be of interest. So I might just draw that in as something to reserve if I can. So I've added that in. Right, that's excellent, because it means we're very close now, ladies and gentlemen, to painting. We've got 2 more things to do. We have to put the shadow map in and a little bit of detail of the beak, because we have this sort of shape. That's good, but we don't have the rim light. So that's the first part of the shadow map, to understand where the light is hitting the edge. And that means that the beak here becomes a bit of an S curve as it stretches out. You'll see what I mean. If you look there, you can kind of see the mouth curves into an S on the shadow line. So it's not a straight line after all. It just tricked us into believing it, or at least me. So I'm now going to turn that into a little S curve. And that looks 10 times better now. Probably a little bit more stretched than what I'm showing. It probably goes upwards a little bit more. Yeah, that's better. And there's a little bit of a similar thing going on with the bottom beak. It comes out a little bit wider on the inside. And you have a rim light there. So there is an outside edge of the beak, which is in shadow, and also an outside edge, which is in light. It's getting both in one. So that's good, because now I feel that I can attempt the beak with a bit more confidence. And the last thing, well, we need a shadow map. So for that, I'm going to clear off all the drawings, and I'm going to attempt to show you where I believe the Terminator is. It's very tricky sometimes to show the Terminator, because in daylight you can get bounced light, which breaks the Terminator line in places. But that there is the shadow shape on the underside of the bird. So it comes along that shape we saw there on the throat, goes down. Important not to make it too dark, because otherwise we'll struggle to paint the value to hide the line. The reason being, it's quite a light shadow. It's outside, so it is a little bit lighter with all the daylight. But yeah, there is a shadow there. And here it just tucks in at his belly a little bit because of his legs. And I think that the shadow sort of goes down there, something like that. That's how I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to simplify it. And there is a shadow on the other wing. On this wing. And it's there. Either side of the little negative shape that we drew, either side. So we can either remember that or sketch it out. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to try and remember that. Now, as is customary in this class, we'll have a little break for 5 minutes so people can catch up. But before I go, I will definitely want to have a look, see how you're doing, if that's okay, and help if there's any problems. But you see, the last thing I would like to do is the lichen, because we do need to think about this lichen before I leave you in peace for a moment. Now, the lichen can be random as well. It's all to do with the weather and the face of the branch, etc. But you can see this kind of clumpy shape that it's got. And it sits quite high on the branch. It's grown quite considerably and pushed upwards. So I'm having a little bit of fun just making some shapes that could look like lichen. Don't worry if it's not the exact lichen, because it's random as well, a little bit. Or if it's not random, we can make it that way. So, hope this has helped you with your study so far. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so there is the sketch. And bringing the colors onto screen now. So it's standard colors plus neutral tint. I'm going to start off with a size 12 medium size round sable, or synthetic sable will be fine. You'll probably also need a size 6 or small to medium size round point brush. I'm going to start off with the value map, and the value map will tell us where each zone or wash will go. So we usually start with the T wash, which is a T thickness wash. And if I share the other screen, which is the value map, you'll be able to see, hopefully, if I can get this to work, you'll see 3 screens. So I just put one a little bit higher up. There you go. So hopefully what you're seeing now is you'll be able to see that in the background, there is a light medium tone, which is very similar to raw sienna. So here's raw sienna, golden brown. If you don't have raw sienna, you can use yellow ochre, will be fine. But mix a tea wash, and into that, I'm going to add a tiny touch of either permanent rose, the pink, or you could use burnt sienna, which will warm this up just a touch. I used a bit of pink as well. And just finally, a tiny amount of neutral tint, just to neutralize a little bit of that yellow tone as you add this in, as your tone in the background. You'll see it'll give you kind of an out of focus color is what we're after, but it will give you the starting point for that. So if you just bring that tone into the background, now notice on the image, the reference image, it is slightly out of focus, but there's some areas of more light and some areas of a little bit less light. So there is some flexibility with that, because you can see it's someone's garden. That's what I think that is. And you're just seeing abstract shapes. So while this is still wet, what I tend to do, which if I bring my bucket into screen, that's important, I clean the brush and then just dry it a little bit and soften the edges. Do you see? Where I want to develop this idea of the abstract shape. Now, while it is still wet, if I add a little bit more neutral tint now to a slightly thicker consistency and a little bit more raw sienna and a little bit more pink or crimson, it doesn't really matter which, you'll get a dirtier brown color that you can now start to create more abstract shapes into that background, wet into wet. Okay. And while that's still wet, you've got a little bit of time to play with these abstract ideas in the background. Because some of the areas are slightly darker. and some areas are slightly softer. So again, I clean my brush, dry the brush, and then I just playfully attend to those edges. That's very important with watercolor, because what we really want to avoid is bringing attention to the background other than a context of tone, okay, in this particular painting. I hope that's helping. Right, and then once you have your background, then it's a case of looking for our next tone in the light middle value. So, is there anywhere on the bird that's light middle value? Well, yeah, perhaps the beak, edge. There is a highlight on the eye. There's also the fluffy stuff around his wing, on his chest there, at the side of his armpit, if you like. So these areas are very light. So I'm going to take a little bit of tea thickness raw sienna, playfully add this to the bottom part of the bird here. And to the wing, because there's some golden tones within the wing, and to the tail.
The same colors.
Oh,
The
same
same color. Anywhere else where I might see that? Not really. That's probably all on the body of the bird. I could give a little bit of that color to the feet. And then I'm going to move to my next color. Now, to try to join this golden color into the next color is my next job. And the next color is a gray. So if I take some neutral tint and I mix that to a tea thickness, very thin, you can see it's tea thickness, and I put it wet into wet. So it goes into that golden color, wet into wet. And you'll get a kind of a merging of the two tides of color. That's a nice way to create a link. And then I bring that color upwards to the edge of the red breast. Now, it just so happens there is a little bit of this gray tone in the tail as well. And a little bit of this gray tone, perhaps a little bit at the top of the head. And to the side of his mask. And then I'm going to clean my brush and dry the brush like so on an old cloth and just soften that edge for a moment. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because there is more to happen here, but it's coming later. So rather like a comma or a punctuation mark in a sentence mid-flow, I pause the activity by softening the edge, and now I pick up my orange. There it is. I'm going for tea thickness again. And I'm going to touch that in to the edge of that gray. And I want this to go in somewhat wet into wet as well. Like so. And again, it's tea thickness. All of these first washes are tea thickness. I'm trying to be careful around the edges of the beak. So if I go into any area that really doesn't want to be orange, I can lift it out. You have a moment to do that. So you've got to be kind of quick. And I just look for any changes in the tone. Now, I notice on the value map here, his chest goes a little bit lighter there. Do you see that? So now I've got the gray there. To make it a little bit lighter, I clean the brush, squeeze the brush, and just lift a little bit there. See that? Just a little bit. Because it just so happens there's a bounced light there. And we're almost through the first wash of the bird. The next area will be the beak, the wing, and maybe the neck. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix a little bit of pink, tea wash. So these are all thin washes, and that's going to go into the bird's mouth. You can see it's very, very light. A little bit of pink. I can also, no, I'll save that actually. I'll add a little bit of burnt or raw sienna. I'm using raw sienna. That's the lighter of the two browns that you have. And that's where I'm going to now start to bring that onto the feet. A little bit. And the wing. You'll notice if the color is the correct value, because it will be very similar to the raw sienna, but just a little bit darker. And I just let that run down the side of the wing, and a little bit of that color now I will add to the gray. Remember the gray we used for the chest? If you mix the two colors together, you'll get a silvery golden gray, and that's what I'm going to put on the side of his head, like so. And that's the first wash of the bird. And if you paint it into any areas by accident, like I did the fluffy bit there, I just want to lift that out now and soften any edges, like the turning of the shadow to the light. And that's the first wash. That's a very important wash as well, because this is where we capture the light. I just lifted a small amount of light on that orange area under his throat where it pushes inwards, just a little bit there. And now I'm ready to put some color on my branch. So the branch, well, it ranges from golden yellows or greeny yellows through to a very neutral brown gray. So with that in mind, I'm going to clean a well. Here we go. I'm going to add some yellow. There we are. That's a good color to begin. Probably go a little bit stronger than tea and just bring that along the branch where the lichen is. Maybe even add a bit more yellow. So it now goes from tea to coffee, and start to increase some of the tones of yellow. It gives a feeling of textures. And now I'm going to start to turn towards browns. So I'm going to use a little bit of burnt sienna, raw sienna, sorry, but you can use burnt sienna, and add that to the edge of your branch, the upper edge, which is catching the light. Like so. And while it's still wet, add a little bit more, either raw or burnt sienna, and a touch of neutral tint to grey it. And then just add that into the branch, wet into wet. Try not to paint onto the feet of your bird, so be careful around the feet. And then when you get to about halfway of the turn, add more neutral tint and touch that in to the halfway point, because what you're going to do then is you're going to turn the form of your branch. So I'm going to paint the branch pretty much wet into wet. So I add more neutral tint now, and this time I'm going to milky thickness, so it's quite a bit stronger. And I touch that in. And at the same time as I paint the sort of shape of the branch, I'll also add some of the textures of the gnarly protrusions that we see on the branch. So I have a little bit of fun. I can make it up a little bit as well. You know that the branch is a little bit lumpier. And this is a really nice area to be playful, with shadows and textures within the branch, because we're not going to come back to it. We're really just going to do it once and have a bit of fun. And you can see what I'm doing as well. I bring some of the shapes into the wet areas that I've recently painted, because I want to create a feeling of form and textures in one go. And that's real fun. That's watercolors in action. And there's the branch. So I hope you enjoyed that, because we're not going to come back to it. It's pretty much done. The only thing I would say is you can add a little bit of green. This is just pure green into the lichen. Just to add a little bit more of an idea of what it is we're seeing there. And it will more than likely be enough. We'll see. It could be that we just need a few fine details, and that'll be it. Okay, so I hope that's given you possibilities for the first wash and pretty much completing that branch. I have to say there's not a lot you need to do with the branch once you've got the actual shape turning its form. And there we are. Bit of fun. Now, the first wash is very important because it sets the tone for the light. But after the tone is set, we then need to start to consider the middle values. Now, in watercolor, the middle values are achieved by using coffee to milk thickness washes. So let's just have a look where the middle values are occurring. So we have some middle values on the wing, around the head, on the chest or the breast, and definitely on the tail. These middle values also get darker to dark middle values, so we'll go thicker later. But for now, on top of this, we can add our next color, and it will be the same colors pretty much that we've used, but getting stronger. So with that in mind, the first wash that we used was a raw sienna, which is this color here. So I go a little bit stronger towards coffee milky thickness. I'll add a little bit of neutral tint to it, just to gray it to a golden brown. And this is where I'm going to start to put a little bit of fluffiness on the mottles of his body under his wing there. Do you see just a few feathery marks? Then I'll carry those on into the shadowy shapes, just a little bit. And then this will give way to grays. So this was my gray area. So if I add a little bit more neutral tint to a coffee thickness, and now I'm going to start to put feathers in gray. And I'm thinking about the form of the animal as well. It sort of turns this away. So I'm following it, the sort of his body shape, sometimes little shadows, little feathers, sorry. And I carry this on all the way up to his red breast. And then I do something very important, which is I clean my brush, dry it on the cloth a little bit, and then just soften these edges in places, because what I'd like to do is create a feeling of soft transitions on those feathers. And that has to be done very quickly as you move through those areas. When you've got that connecting to that, you'll start to see a little bit of the form of the body. You can also add a little bit of the previous color, that golden brown, just to augment it a little bit on the shadowy edge. You see there, just to build it up a bit more. And that's working quite well. Good. So I've gone from the golden sort of brown underside of the bird to the gray belly. Now I move into the orange. Now the orange goes stronger, thicker. So that's now milky thickness. But I'm going to also add a little bit of burnt sienna, that reddish brown. And now I'm going to start to push that into the mix. Let it mix into the grays as well that you've painted. And this time I'm trying to create with my brush little feathery strokes. Remember to follow the form as we go underneath the bird, under his neck. Let these brush strokes follow through to the form. Try to stroke the form, and I think that way you'll definitely have more success with the feeling of the form of that bird. Now, while it's still wet, I will add a little bit more color into it. So I'm going to carry on around the side. Remember, we had this light area here. So I carry on around this, and from his head down to towards the beak. But I'm going to now start to get this mixture a little bit stronger. I'm adding cadmium red and burnt sienna. Let's see if I can increase the strength of the reds. Wet into wet. and try to see if you can capture the feeling of the waves within the plumage. So that's starting to happen. Like so. That's good. And you'll notice it's still not strong enough. There is a darker middle value, but this is good because we're gradually capturing the form. So that's good. And then light before I clean my brush, dry my brush, and see if I can just soften a few edges here and there. Right, so that's the second pass on the body. Now I go into the mouth of the bird again. Now, if you remember, we had a pink. So there's my pink. I'm going to add to it a little bit of neutral tint to make it a sort of gray pink. And this time I'm going to start by going into the mouth area, trying not to paint the light edge of the rim of the mouth. And then I paint this pinkish gray outwards. It's darkest actually the deeper you go into the bird's mouth, and also the underside of the upper beak gets quite dark. And then once you feel that you've got a feeling of the shadow going back, clean your brush, dry your brush, and then just soften the edge so that this transitions from that tone to the original pink tone. That's quite important. And I'll use a little bit of that color around the outside edge of his beak, just to start the idea of the outside edge. But notice I don't paint into the rim light on the edge of the beak. Very important. And a little bit as a frame on the outside edge on both beak areas. See that? And that's working very well. There's also a little bit of this pink color to be found on the feet and the eye. Around the eyeball, there is a pink tone or a lighter tone, which I think this will work well for. So just paint that as an edge around the eye. And then I pick up the rest of the pink gray tone and I paint the legs, the lower side of the leg first, leaving some light hitting the top, around the knuckles, bringing the foot downwards. And just having fun trying to express those feet shapes as they connect along the branch system. So that was fun. Okay, so this is working well so far, but now we need to go into the wing shape again. And for the wing, we had burnt sienna, sorry, tea time again. This time, milky thickness. Sorry, that's raw sienna, but if you've got raw umber, If you've got burnt umber, that should work as long as you add a bit of raw sienna. This is a sort of golden brown. And I'm just going to put a little bit on that wing just to see how it connects. And I think it's okay, but maybe it's a little bit strong. So I'll add a little bit of water and a little bit of neutral tint just to gray it. Because what I'd like to do is just try to create a feeling of feathery fluff on the wing as it goes down to the first section of feathers. So I leave a little bit of the light tone showing. There we go. And then I carry on with this same color in little striated, stripy shapes going down the wing. Like a concertina or a fan, a lady's fan closed up. I'm reserving the light shapes that I know are there. And now the wing starts to develop some depth. There is a little bit of this gray brown tone as well at the side of the eye here. And along the tail. Like so. And of course, on the inside, shadowy side of the lower part of the body here, underneath the wing. So these are all areas where you could use a little bit more of that tone. And maybe just a little bit, you know, on the shadow side here of the underside of the belly, just along your shadow line, you could start to add a little bit more of that brownish plumage. So we're going into the next value there. So it's getting a little bit more detailed. So it's gradually coming to life, but there are more areas to be concerned with. The head of the bird is looking good, but this is a gray area. And so I need more neutral tint. So I just add a bit of neutral tint to that brown because it's very close to the color I'm after, but it's more gray than it is brown. That's what I think. So if I add neutral tint and just check to see how that looks on the edge, first of all. If it's too dark, which it could be, add a little bit of water. But, you know, the edge is a little bit darker anyway, so that's a good place to try. I think it needs a bit more water. Yeah, that's better. And now what I'm doing is I'm creating little feathery marks. To connect down to that wing. And it is a slightly cooler gray brown. And what I sometimes do when I'm trying to create the contrast that I'm after, it is slightly lighter here than there. I'll just clean my brush, dry it on a cloth, and then just lift a little bit until I get the value I'm after. Like so. So that's good because now I've got this sort of mottled, feathery connection between the grays, the brown, and we're really very close now to going into the darker middle values. So I'm going to wait there. But if you're catching up and you're almost there, if you're wanting to keep going, just add a little bit of the gray tone, neutral tint to the eye. But if you can, keep the highlight reserved. Otherwise, you'll just have to paint it on with white later. And I prefer just to get it painted without having to go back. So there it is. First hit of the eye. Just making sure it's what I want it to look like. And that's looking very good. So we have connected a lot of tones there. So if you have at this point a kind of a soft spot there where it doesn't look strong enough to break away from the background, well done, because that means you've followed the sequence of values. We're going to go darker now, and that's when this part of the belly will stand out. I can assure you it's going to start to happen then, if not already. So in this last value area of the, sorry, it's not the last, there is a dark accent, but this area is the dark middle value, and we can see on the grey map there, it's quite a bit of the shadow area, quite a bit on the belly. We have built up lights, light middle values, middle value, and now we go into the darker middle value. And this is where it really will be stronger on the red. Now, to get the orangey red to go stronger, that's not an easy thing to do, because if you add neutral tint to the orange, you'll likely make a horrible color. So how can you make orange go darker with that red note? Well, there's several ways. The best way I can think of is you add crimson, which is a very strong red, to cadmium red, and then a very deep red, sorry, crimson's deep. And then with the mixture of those two, if you were to add, I'm going to add some orange to it anyway, because it just feels like you need the orange. If you add a blue-green to that, it will darken. But a blue-green is a viridian or a phthalo green, so a dark green. So you have to be careful, because when I put it on, you'll see it'll go kind of like a black spot. And if you add too much, you will end up with grey. So be careful. Add a small dot of green and then stir that in, because the viridian and phthalo are very strong colors. And just see if you can make a darker orange color, see, like that, that still feels like an orange. And if it doesn't work, then add a little bit more crimson. If it starts to go too green, add a little bit more crimson to balance. And that's going to go here. You see there? That's what we're after. Right, so that's the color that I'm going to use for the chest, the breast rather. I also need a darker gray. There's my gray. So I just take neutral tint. There's a dark middle value, which is, I'm tempted not to go as strong as creamy. It's too dark otherwise. Maybe I will add a little bit of cerulean blue, just to give it a feeling of slightly cooler feeling, because neutral tint is neutral. We want a little bit of a cooler tone there. You have to be careful it's not too dark. I think that will work. Okay, and we're ready. So I'm going to pick up the gray and I'm going to start to touch it in at the plumage down here. Very small amounts. So very small sort of tentative strokes to begin with at the edge of the shadow. And then as we start to get further up into the bird's shape, maybe at the edge here as well, define the edge of his chest. Like so, you see that? Define the edge of his feet against his underside. That's a good thing to do. Bring these little marks upwards to the side of his chest, especially here where the shadow breaks away from the fluffiness. This is quite a tricky area because grays can be quite tricky for some because they're not colors, obviously. And I'm bringing it towards the boundary of the orange breast. And once I get there, I will then pick up the orange color that I mixed. Remember this deep orangey red brown. Let it touch into the gray as well, by all means, that's fine. Around that part of his throat there. And then I'm going to soften those edges because the paper's probably a little bit dry by now. And I'm also thinking about the shadowy side here. So crimson, red, orange, a little bit of green, and you'll get a sort of golden, warm, orangey brown. It's quite creamy thickness. And then to get it to turn on the highlight area, I just soften that with a damp brush, clean the brush, soften it on the edge. Almost there. Almost. However, we need to create a shadow under his throat there. Now, if I want to make that go even darker, I have to think of the opposite color to orange, which we would know is a blue. So if I add a blue, I know I've added blue-green. If I add blue now, you will get a color which is very similar to burnt, raw umber, sorry. You could use raw umber, but it's nice to try to get the mix correct by adding blue. See if you can do it yourself. And you'll see it goes darker, and you can use that wherever you feel that you need to go darker next. And by doing that, you will retain the orange red breast, and you'll make it go darker as well, which is what we need to do. So a robin may have a red breast, but it's not really just red. It's a lot more than that. I'm just having a bit of fun there, adding a little bit of the grays back in, closer to the shadow. And then finally, I had a bit of the gray that I have here and a bit of the orange. And I can mix another color, which is similar, but slightly different, which also you can use to touch in to the feathers. And I just try to create a feeling of those textures of the feather. You know, it's following the form. Red and green as well, if I use crimson and viridian together, will give you a gray. And then if you add a little bit of orange, you'll get an even darker tone if you need an extra bit of depth. Like there. And there. Just at the side of his eye, towards his beak, it's a little bit darker there. And there we are. So I have now got the breast of the bird complete. What else do I need? Well, it's likely now that I'll need to finish the beak, the eye, the claws, the wing, and the tail. So for those, I'm just going to use literally neutral tint as the dark accent for these areas. So starting off with creamy thickness, neutral tint, I am going to go into the beak. So underneath this area here, you have a very dark shape of a sort of a triangle. And underneath the beak here, you have another little dark shape of a triangle. It's a bit longer actually. And then we go into towards the eye. Just getting that shape right. Now for the eye, you've got to be very careful not to damage what you've already drawn, but you're going to try to orbit around the highlight, but leave a little bit of gray leading to it. So you can see there, I've increased the gray. And what I'm also going to do is just soften the transition from the dark to the gray to make that eye pop out, which is good. I just draw a few little feathers as well with odds and ends of brown color that I used on the chest here. There's no reason why I can't put that little fluffy bit around his eye, the top of his head there, just to match the depth that I feel I'm seeing with that black eye in there now. And that gives the whole thing more definition. A little bit more of the neutral tint into the areas around the plumage around the head there. That looks better. And with the neutral tint, if I carry on, because it's really the finishing touches to the painting, this is the dark accent. And we're going to take this down to the feathers. We're going to put in some of these darker accents that we see along the body of the bird. Like so. And once I've got those sort of, I think, working to a degree, what I'll do is I'll just clean my brush and then soften the edges for the transition from the shadow towards the light. And that gives me even more form. Use a little bit more of that on the tail. Might use some broken edges there to create a feeling of fluffiness. That works. And then as I go underneath the feathery bits for his feet here, it's fluffy. And his feet sort of pop out from the fluffy plumage. Maybe a little bit more brown as well. You know, you've got to try to match the fluffiness that you're seeing. Yeah, that feels better. And more neutral tint, just to finally pull the foot out from the shadows there a little bit. And I think I'm quite close to finishing, but what I'd like to do is just to have a look at the lichen. Now, remember we just put a sort of a green and a yellow color together, but now with the neutral tint, I can now start to add the scale, the textures that you associate with lichen. I like the abstract qualities that I've achieved, so I want to keep some of it. You know, lichen has this sort of cauliflower edge, so I like that. So I'll bring some of that out. And maybe in places, just let the abstract qualities work. So there's the lichen, so that's working well. And then you finally look at your bird and you see, have I captured the light here and then the shadow? And if so, well done. Have I captured the liveliness of the eye and the depth of the mouth? And if not, why not? Well, maybe it needs a bit more depth just into the throat there, down the mouth. So I just add a little bit more tone with the neutral tint. And then soften those transitions with a clean, damp brush. Just like we always do. There's nothing new in the approach. It's the same techniques, but just in the right places. So now the mouth has come to life, and you can really push that, you know, it's the darkest part. If you look on the value map here, it's very dark, so you can even go even darker there while it's still wet. And look, the mouth just goes deeper because of it. And then the last thing I want to do before I finish this evening is I take my small brush, which said if you've got a number 6, that would be good. I'm using a little weasel brush from my Chinese calligraphy set, which is nice. And I'm just going to take some burnt sienna, creamy thickness. There it is. That's the warm brown. And I'm just going to put a few more edgy lines on his wing. Because I just feel that there is another color there that I can, even in the fluffiness of this part. And if I clean the brush, dry the brush a little bit and just soften those edges, I believe now I have got my robin. Yes, looks much better for it. I hope you've enjoyed this one. It's not as straightforward as it looks. You know, in the drawing, it certainly feels a lot easier than the sparrow was. But in the painting, as you saw with the breast, there's quite a lot more involvement with the plumage. And I dare say you could push it even more if you wanted to. You could put a little bit more depth in there. But I feel that I've achieved what I wanted to do, which is get my robin singing on his branch. And so at that point, I'm going to stop the share and the recording and see how you've done.